While sanding is understandably not one of the most enjoyable tasks when working with wood, it's incredible how it's evolved. So the next time you're busy doing this, think about the evolution of this important abrasive. In human history, the first recorded use of man-made abrasives occurred in China during the 13th century. Shells, sand, and seed were paired with natural gum on parchment paper and used as an abrasive. During the Middle Ages, besides using planes and scrapers, they used coarse vegetative materials as well as minerals like pumice and rotten stone. By the 17th and 18th century, our woodworking forefathers turned to shark and ray skins, known as shagreen, to more or less polish the wood. And a century later, glass and sand were mixed with hide glue and added to parchment paper. This was known as glass paper. Let me show you 10 quick tips that I use in my shop when it's time to smooth things. Like my last full-size tip video, I've indexed each of the tips so that you can easily move on if you've already seen the tip. I've also got links that you'll find in the description that go along with the video. Let's get started.
There is a flame that burns inside myself.
This tip is so simple but so easily overlooked. Keep a sanding block on a leash when you cut wood. Blades both sharp and dull leave behind uncut fibers. Some woods like maple are more prone to this than others, but all wood species can potentially leave these fuzzy edges behind. This might seem insignificant, but uncut fibers can raise your wood stock off the surface of the table, away from fences, and make glue-ups difficult. If you're cutting several pieces from the same board, it means that no matter how perfect you set your blade, you'll be left with imperfect cuts and gaps in your glue-ups. Okay, so don't actually put your sanding block on a rope, but keep it nearby. The best grit I've found to knock off these wood boogers is 80 grit. Turn the block to a 45-degree angle and add a couple swipes. Done. Everyone knows what this is. It's an eraser, it fixes chewed nails, and it even makes rough things smooth. But maybe you didn't know that you can add sandpaper to the curved part. This will give you a chance to sand curved things a little better, but there is an even better reason to do it this way. Try it yourself. And no, you don't have to forfeit the sanding surface on the flat side. Once you've attached the sandpaper, hold it to the palm of your hand and roll forward as you sand. I think you'll be surprised by how much more sanding can be done in a shorter period of time. Of course, you wouldn't want to use this method on a large surface, but personally I generally only use these sanding blocks to clean up scuffs, dirt, and pencil marks. This is a quicker, excellent way to achieve that. Once you've tried this method in the palm of your hand, try sanding a curve. I think you'll be surprised by how easy it is. Strip and disc sanders are some of the most powerful tools to quickly clean edges as well as creating and forming different shapes. Unlike belt sanders and ROS sanders, you'll more oftentimes use these to sand end grain. The worst thing that you can do is use a higher grit when sanding. I cannot recommend it enough to you that you always use the lowest grit you can and avoid anything over 80 grit. Sanding with higher grit will do nothing but clog your sandpaper and you will end up with burns. Because you're using a lower grit, you need to understand that sanding with both a strip and disc sander is completely different than face sanding with a belt and ROS sanders. The idea isn't to hold the wood to the sandpaper for long extended periods of time, but instead to do quick bursts of sanding. Using higher grits and holding stock to these surfaces are great recipes for burning. My own personal experience, I have found that the best sandpaper to use for both sanders is zirconia. The table you've been working on for months is now finished after connecting the base. All that's left, sanding. But you find a sea of sanding sizes when you shop your local super hardware store. 60, 80, 100, 120, 150, 180, 220, 320, 400? What madness have you gotten yourself into? Let's quickly break this all down. The lower the grit, the more that will get sanded off. But plan on sanding in a low to high sequence. Start with 100, move on to 120, and finish with 180. This is a winning strategy, but there's a slight trick to it. As you sand with the grain, carefully watch your surface for scratches. With each progression, you're cleaning up the previous step. Now you could go above 180, but the problem you'll run into is your finishes or dyes might not be able to penetrate into the surface. To get around that, use a super fine grit after your finish has been added and sand very lightly. Before you sand, check out my important video that explains raising the grain. Your first time using a disc sander might have looked like this. The immediate answer is that the sanding disc spins in a counterclockwise rotation. Any work done on the right side of your table will be lifted instead of pressed down, like the left side of your table. You just can't argue with physics, and you'll really know this if your sander came with a guard preventing the use of that side. And that should probably be the end of this bite size, except you can technically cheat and be perfectly safe doing it. To do this trick, you'll have to remember a few things. First, the stock you're using will need to be in a constant motion, which isn't much of a shocker as you shouldn't ever hold your stock against the sander. Second, that motion is never from right to left and is always starting from the left and moving to the right. Third, the pressure you put on the stock should be greater as you push down than as you press against the disc. This might mean a few passes to get your edge sanded where it should be, but it also prevents burning. And finally, the only time you should ever use this method is when the width of your stock is wider than the center of your sanding disc. Shorter stock is not safe. Disc and thin strip belts can be difficult to store, and something I used to hate searching for when I needed to go through the sanding progression that we talked about in Bite Size 62. Sanding can be one of the most mundane tasks, so it only makes sense to make them easily accessible. There have been a lot of sanding drawers, cubby holes, and different ways to stack it, but these can still be cumbersome and a lot of work to build. A really cheap solution that I found is to use dowels. As you can see here, I hang my thin strip belts on the side of my sanding cabinet. With a simple 1/4 inch dowel, I can cut it into 2.5 inch lengths and drill them into a scrap piece of plywood. After labeling each section, I hang or attach it to the wall with a couple hooks, and it's easy to grab one of these and go. While it's not a custom-made cabinet, it's minimalistic and portable, meaning I can bring it to my bench. When it's time to grab sandpaper to clean things up, understand that not all sandpaper are equal. In an effort to chart and give abrasives a value depending on particle size, a number of different standards have been created. The two most popular standards are CAMI and FIPA. While there is a long and very complicated answer to how each standard is defined and classified, depending on the sandpaper manufacturer, they might choose to formulate their own grit that doesn't comply with the standards anyway. A good rule of thumb to save yourself a headache is to stick with a brand or even a standard. CAMI generally uses a coarser standard and is usually represented as just a number, while FIPA tends to be more fine and has a P in front of the number. Although there are different classifications, the sanding process is the same no matter what standard you go with. Start coarse, use a medium value, and finish fine. If you want to complicate your woodworking and dig deeper into the subject, I have a link to a long article in the description below. If you need to cut sandpaper either for a sanding block, spindle, or drum sander, you've got to make the sandpaper cutter. While this tip has been around for decades and requires only a hacksaw blade and a piece of plywood, we're going to tweak it and make it more precise. I'll start off with a 6 inch by 14 inch piece of plywood. I'll add a thin strip that's 1 inch by 6 inches to the edge. I'll put my blade on, but I want to make sure that the teeth are right on the edge. After hitting it with an awl, we'll screw it in, but not before we add small washers so that it's easy to get our sandpaper in. You can buy this measuring tape that's cut in 12 inch segments, which is great for jigs like this. We'll peel off one and add it to the thin strip we added, with 0 at the teeth. With a second strip, we'll place it on the blade, with the 0 butting up against the strip. Now we can easily slide our sandpaper in, measure our first cut, and tear, and rotate it again to get the final tear. Because every tool should have a place, we'll add an eyelet to the center by drilling and screwing it in, and a hook to our sanding cabinet. If you're tired of buying expensive sanding rolls either for a spindle or a drum sander that wear out quickly, why not make your own? My local hardware store started selling ceramic sandpaper that's 60 grit. This kind of sandpaper is not only durable, but it quickly removes waste. I can get 5 sheets of 9x11 sandpaper for less than $6. But if I wanted to buy sandpaper rolls for my jet, it would cost me $20 for a few rolls. And these rolls aren't using the latest and greatest abrasives like zirconium and ceramic. This makes my oscillating spindle sander a more attractive tool, knowing I have more control over the consumables, as well as a beast of a tool allowing me to use it like a saw. If you don't have an oscillating spindle sander, I'll show you how to make your own drum sander for your drill press using hardwood and carriage bolts, as well as a jig for your drill press to get the most out of that drum sander. I'll also show you how to make these sanding sticks that easily fit in the chuck of your drill press. Random orbital sanders, or RO sanders, are an upgrade to orbital sanders. While both sanders spin sandpaper in a circular motion, the RO sander creates erratic, overlapping orbits which prevent swirling patterns that have plagued orbital sanders, especially when removing heavy material. Besides swirling problems, orbital sanders use sandpaper sheets that are clamped to the bottom, which is problematic as sandpaper not stretched out completely can fail. RO sanders, on the other hand, use Velcro and are much more rigid and have a longer lifespan. Here's a few tips I've learned over the years sanders using an RO sander. Downward pressure can damage the sanders as well as leave uneven sanding. You might be tempted to leave the speed at its highest all the time, but due to heat and dust clogging, think of high speeds for heavy removal using lower grits and lower speeds for higher grit. This makes it more difficult to clog the paper as lower grits have larger, fewer grains, and higher grits have a finer and greater number. Finally, keep the sander flat and use a sanding block to remove isolated marks on the surface. One of the hardest things I've struggled with in the past is making round, hollow wooden tubes. You might remember this little jig I created a couple years ago that allows you to make double dowels. Really quickly, here's how it works. You take a cylindrical piece of wood and place it in a hole that's the same size. At the base of the hole, there's a nail that sits at the center of the hole. You pop the dowel in, hammer it to find your center, and then drill it out. There is still a little bit of error that can be made as you drill it due to drill press inaccuracies. But I found a very simple answer that works every time. Instead of finding the center of a cylinder, we'll find the center of a block of wood. The shape really doesn't matter. Now we'll drill through it and leave the drill bit attached inside the block of wood, and we'll use a belt sander of some kind around it. Now we have a round block of wood with a perfect center. This guy will make a great handle for a future project. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found something useful for your shop. If you did, please leave a comment below and let me know. A big thank you to my patrons that help to keep the blades spinning in my shop. Thank you, Michelle B., Keith Current, William L. McNally, Jerry Adams, Tommy QR, Zach Finch, Rich Lightfoot, and Tudor the Barbarian. Hit the thumbs up, subscribe, and ring that bell. And I thank you so much for being a part of my shop. Please leave a comment below. Come find me on Instagram at Make Things with Rob. And remember to keep making things.
There is a flame that burns inside myself.